Chapter 17. Mago's Escape. In slow motion, Odd saw the soldier behind him lift his weapon, and in the midst of all the confusion he seemed to hear the click of the trigger. There was a deafening explosion, and the boy closed his eyes, gripping the short, gleaming coat of the panther with all his might. The creature jumped, carrying him up high, and for a moment he couldn't tell which way was up. When he reopened his eyes, he realized that he was still in one piece. The soldier was splayed out on the floor beneath the claws of the digital panther, complaining in a foreign language. "Yee-hee! Yeah!" Odd cried, his shout becoming a crazed, wild laugh. The boy quickly analyzed the situation. Alita and Eva were doing superbly. The unicorn galloped between the soldiers, throwing them to the ground with violent kicks, while its elf rider threw energy fields. Eva shouted tirelessly, creating a shower of sharp notes in all colors that battered the Green Phoenix men. Some of them had already dropped their weapons and fled. Odd turned just in time to see the lift door close. In the cabin was a man dressed in yellow. "Hannibal Mago is escaping!" someone yelled. The boy turned in the direction of the voice. "Hannibal Mago is escaping!" someone yelled. The boy turned in the direction of the voice. The person who had called out was Professor Hertz, who was on the other side of the narrow opening. Odd scrutinized the door. It wasn't very large, but he made a decision. He dug his heels into the panther's flanks and lay down along its spine, his face pressed against its soft fur, trying to stay as low down as possible. The creature immediately understood his intentions and crossed the room at a dizzying speed while Mago's soldiers leapt out of the way so as not to be barreled over. The panther leaned over the opening, angled its head, stuck its paws out in front, and jumped. It flew across the 1.5-meter wide vertical tunnel and landed on the other side between the turbines. Odd greeted the Ishiyamas. Then he saw Richard and his face lit up. "Would you happen to know if we can go down from here?" Yes, Richard babbled, a distraught expression on his face. "We came through the ventilation shafts, but I mean, there are stairs." "Perfect!" exclaimed Odd. "In that case, hop on." "But where?" "Well, on the panther's back, of course. We're going to give Mago what's coming to him once and for all." Auric and Yumi approached each other and took one another's hand. Then they smiled and embraced. You did great," said Auric, his gaze drawn to the girl's deep, dark eyes. "I say that we both did amazingly," she responded with a smile. And indeed they had. All the soldiers in the scanner room had been neutralized. They were now all in a corner, tied up in pairs. Each soldier carried a pair of handcuffs on their belt, and they had proven very useful for the children. Auric's manta ray was on the floor, and now seemed like a large orange rug. The silver fox was beside it, its head between its paws. "So what do we do now?" Yumi asked. Auric shrugged and thought about it for a moment. "Let's go to the factory ground floor and finish the job." The lift was in use. The children pressed the call button and waited impatiently for the door to open. When the container finally brought them up with the low sound of the creaking of cables and the door opened, they were greeted by a very real war zone. There were dozens and dozens of soldiers shooting at one another, hiding behind piles of metal beams or taking cover behind trolleys of equipment and enormous bobbins of cables. Some of them were dressed in the Green Phoenix's green uniform, and others wore neoprene wetsuits and large bulletproof vests of the same color. Yumi let out a slow breath, stupefied. "Let's join the battle," encouraged Auric. The little samurai jumped onto his manta ray and drew his katana. A throwing knife as sharp as a razor blade hurtled towards Auric, and the boy sliced right through its middle with a perfectly calculated two-handed swing of his sword. He then plunged headfirst into the melee of bodies, shouts, and bullets. Dido and Principal Delmas were in the science laboratory. The woman, who wore a pair of large headphones that hid her ears, kept her eyes riveted on her computer monitors. By her side, Delmas silently observed everything, seated on a chair far too small for his stature. The principal was afraid. Dido knew this, and she, too, was afraid. But there was no going back. The clock on the wall in front of them showed that it was 18 minutes past midnight. The image on the main monitor trembled for a moment, to then draw the lines that made up Maggie's face. "So," said Dido, tautly, after letting out a sigh, "we've received the preliminary report from Aerial Squadron 1 and Infantry Squadron 3. Unfortunately, there's no good news. Someone blew up the bridge between the bank and the island, and the Green Phoenix's defensive weapons prevented our Delta planes from landing on the factory roof. These two teams are now isolated outside." Dido let out yet another deep sigh. Thanks to the headphones, Principal Delmas hadn't heard a single word, but he must have figured out something after seeing her expression. The woman had her hands on her knees, tense like claws, crumpling her pants, and the veins in her forearms were beginning to swell. "And Squadron 2?" she asked, not without fear. "The frogmen made it to the objective. Unfortunately, the sides of the island were covered in alarms that alerted the terrorists. We lost contact with them, but thanks to Squadron 3's reports, we know that a gunfight took place inside the building. Tell Squadron 3 that they need to get to the Hermitage. I want that house terrorist free as soon as possible." Dido opened a window on the screen. It was the image of a fighter bomber, an F-16 with no distinctive markings and triangular wings loaded with missiles. Black Raven. At what level are we in the other operation? Dido asked. Black Raven left our secret base in Ireland on time. It will reach the objective at the set time. Good, commented Dido. She paused a moment to think before continuing. I want peer-to-peer radio communication to be in contact with the pilot. I'll be the only person who can communicate with him. The secretary nodded. I sincerely hope that Black Raven will return to base with all its cargo, madam. Yes, Maggie, I hope so too. Odd and Richard left the staircase behind them and arrived in the machine room that Mago's soldiers had turned into a lunchroom. When the panther burst into the room, all the men leapt to their feet and brandished their weapons. Odd spurred his creature. It bounded and galloped towards the row of tables with a terrifying roar. Richard responded with a small, scared whimper. It was Odd's favorite style, a classy, grand entrance. The boy stood up on the back of the panther as it ran and readied himself. While Richard continued his insane race across the tables, he grabbed into a tube coming out of the ceiling and, using it like a gymnastic bar, he spun around, shooting laser arrows left and right. He aimed with great precision, destroying weapons, disarming the soldiers, and throwing knives flying as they hurtled into the room like a deadly swarm. He then let himself fall, landed on the back of a soldier and knocked him upside down, ran across the table, and continued to shoot arrows low to the ground. He was having the time of his life. Yumi had already figured out how things worked. The soldiers in green were the bad guys, and the ones in black were good. When she and Oryx arrived, the ones in black were losing the battle. There were few of them, while the green Phoenix soldiers were like the heads of the Lernaean Hydra. However, the two children had already shifted the balance of forces on the battlefield. It was like they were everywhere at once. Oryx appeared in the middle of the confrontation on his manta ray, spinning his sword around like a helicopter rotor, while Yumi's silver fox flashed here and there throughout the room, dancing between shadows and stacks of beams to then attack the terrorists by surprise. The girl spotted the thin metal columns holding up the framework of the footbridge glisten as it caught the light. Her fans cut through the air, slicing straight through the columns as if they were made of butter before returning to her hands. The green Phoenix soldiers huddled together under the platform raised their heads, distracted by a groaning sound from above, and saw as the footbridge fell on top of them. Nice shot, called a voice. Yumi turned around and smiled. Odd and Richard had entered through a door. The older boy was lying on the back of the large panther, which seemed to be out of control, while Odd followed him in long jumps, pushing himself off any surface, be they horizontal or vertical. He looked like a real cat. Watch out for the guy dressed in yellow, he immediately shouted. It's Hannibal Mago! Yumi turned in the direction Odd was pointing, and a number of the men in black did the same, to immediately open fire. The girl saw the boss of the Green Phoenix who, hurling all sorts of colorful curses and insults, pulled out a large silver gun from his vest to return fire at his enemies. He then hid behind a column to reload his weapon. When he came out from behind his refuge, for a fraction of a second the man and the girl's eyes met. Mago then fired 6 times in a row. Yumi's fox bounded to the side so that the girl wouldn't be hit by the bullets, but they hit it right in the chest. No! Yumi cried. Beneath her, the fox transformed into a shining cascade that dissolved in the air like cinders. The geisha rolled to the floor. A new volley of shots forced her to jump to one side, to safety. Odd arrived beside her and ducked behind a trolley that lay on its side. Yumi gave the man an icy stare. Mago will pay for that. Let's go get him. Org fought with incredible ardor. The manta ray fired lasers from his tail while the boy used his martial arts skills to attack using his sword, dodge, and kick his enemies. Richard wasn't doing too bad either, especially thanks to the panther. Oryx, Yumi called. Odd and I will take care of Mago. The boy jumped from the manta ray in a circular kick that sent 2 soldiers to the floor. He turned and raised 2 fingers as a sign of victory. Okay, the situation's already under control here. Yumi smiled. She and Odd then exchanged glances and both leapt from behind the trolley. The boss of the Green Phoenix had hoisted himself up onto one of the footbridges that was still intact, and was running madly for the doors leading to the offices. Odd took a running jump that landed him directly on the footbridge, bouncing off it as if his legs were springs. Yumi also did a spin in the air, grabbing onto a beam hanging from an old crane and used it like a pendulum to join her friend. Where'd he go? She asked Odd once she'd reached his side. This way. Beneath them, the battle became more intense. The 2 children ran along the footbridge and forced open the door Mago had shut behind. Beneath them, the battle became more intense. The 2 children ran along the footbridge and forced open the door Mago had shut behind him seconds earlier. They were in a room full of gloomy-looking machines. It wasn't a very big space, although the ceiling was very high up. There was a framework of staircases that led from the room to one higher up, the last floor before arriving on the roof. He could be hiding anywhere, whispered Odd, but his sentence was interrupted by the sound of another door closing with a clack. The 2 children raced up the stairs, preparing themselves for combat. Another new room with yet more machinery. This time, the ceiling was a large glass expanse that looked extravagant that way the light of the moon shone through it. Hannibal Mago, clearly visible thanks to his ridiculous canary yellow suit, was climbing along an enormous press. The boss of the Green Phoenix seemed to know this place like the back of his hand. Once he was on top of the machine, massive and covered in gray dust, he stretched out to the glass ceiling and broke one of the panes with the butt of his gun. "Stop!" Yumi shouted. She threw her 2 fans, but the man was quicker than her, and after heaving himself up, he made it up onto the roof, disappearing from view. Yumi got her fans back. She and Odd ran to the press Mago had climbed up and remained on their guard in case of gunfire, but the only thing that came to them from the factory roof was deep silence. The 2 children jumped, found the hole the man had smashed in the glass, and followed him. They now found themselves on the roof of the factory. It was a sloping terrain made of metal and glass that led to the outer gutters, painted an intense gray like mercury by the moonlight. It was very cold up there, and the wind blew so hard it threatened to knock Yumi off balance, slipping on the smooth soles of her wooden geisha sandals. Hannibal Mago was moving along the slope of the roof towards a small platform of red bricks a little lower down. On the platform, there was a case, a metal container on which the symbol of the Green Phoenix had been emblazoned. The man heard the noise the children made behind him and turned his head to look at them while continuing to move forward, slipping and flailing his hands like a large, scared spider. Odd made a step onto a pane of glass, causing it to make a sinister creaking sound, before quickly retreating back onto the iron supports. "Watch where you're going," Yumi said. "This thing could break at any moment." The girl removed her sandals and began to walk in bare feet, following her friend. There was too much wind for her to use her fans, and Mago was too far away for Odd's arrows. They continued on in silence, putting one foot in front of the other, arms spread wide to keep their balance, like a couple of tightrope walkers. Mago moved in a disorderly fashion. He lost his nerve. He still held his gun in one hand, and the weapon bothered him. He placed one foot on a pane of cracked glass, which broke in 2 beneath his weight. Yumi heard a curse and saw the man get back to safety on the iron framework. Mago turned towards them again, noticed the technique the children were using, and he too began to walk on a large imaginary rope, one slow step after the other. Odd shot several arrows, but they hit the crystalline surface without reaching their target. Meanwhile, the boss of the Green Phoenix made it to the brick platform, ducked behind the case, and returned fire. Yumi heard the gunshot, turned around, and saw Odd fall backwards. The shot! It wasn't possible! Mago had managed to hit him! The catboy became enveloped in a dense cloud of blue sparks and disappeared. The girl fixed her gaze on the boss of the Green Phoenix, glaring with complete loathing. She knew that Odd would just appear back in one of the factory scanners completely unharmed, but she couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened to her friend had he not possessed his Lyoko powers. She growled. Mago threw his gun to the side and busied himself opening the case. From it he took a strange metal backpack with large tubes on the lower part. He frantically donned the device, threading his arms to the stiff braces, which he then attached to his upper thighs, and seized a rectangular object that was connected to a side of the backpack by a cable. It seemed just like a video game controller. Mago pressed a button, and the metal backpack lit up with a low noise, to then spit out dense flames from its lower tubes. Finally, Yumi understood what it was, a jetpack. She had seen them in films, but she had never thought that something like that could truly exist. The boss of the Green Phoenix pressed another button, and with a crack, from behind his shoulders opened 2 small wings. He then flew up a few meters. The jet from his propulsion units made the glass part of the roof around him explode into tiny pieces. Hannibal Mago was going to escape without even a scratch. Yumi breathed deeply and began to run on the thin metal beam. She then did a cartwheel with more style than a professional gymnast and landed on the brick platform. The girl, who was now right up behind the man, jumped up and threw her fans, but Mago had noticed her maneuver and spun around, making a tight turn in the air. The fans missed their target and quickly returned to Yumi. The terrorist boss pressed the buttons on the box in his hands and propelled himself backwards. From his throat came a mad laugh, like he was cawing in triumph. "See you never, brat!" For a split second, Yumi saw the light reflect off his golden canine teeth, and then the man turned back around and began to fly off the factory roof and towards the river, gaining speed. He was escaping, and Yumi could no longer stop him. But as soon as he arrived at the gutters, Hannibal Mago heard the sound of fire erupting, accompanied by the disgusting stench of petrol. He'd forgotten the flamethrowers he had installed to prevent possible aerial attacks. The boss of the Green Phoenix let out a cry. He quickly manipulated the jetpack controls, and the backpack zoomed upwards just as one of the jets of fire gushed out beneath his feet. He instinctively raised his hands to protect his face. This would prove to be a big, huge mistake. At first, Yumi didn't understand what was happening. She saw the man hurriedly change direction and climb up into the sky while the factory roof burst alight beneath him, creating a compact wall of fire. Then, all of a sudden, triggered by the dense smoke that rose from the lower part of his jetpack, Mago started to spin around and around at high speed. The boss of the Green Phoenix flew far above the wall of flames and off into the sky, drawing behind him a trail of light like a comet. The flamethrowers extinguished at the same speed they had lit, and in the darkness that flooded the night, Yumi saw Hannibal Mago lose altitude and arc into the silent river, sending up a great splash of water.